Imagine human history for a moment. For the vast majority of it, we were hunters and gatherers. Then, bam, agriculture happens. A huge revolution, right? People settling down, farming. It changed everything. What if some communities, even today, don't really rely on farming as their main thing? That's what we're digging into in this deep dive. We're going to explore these really fascinating lives of pastoralists, nomads, and foragers, communities that carved out their own paths even as farming society started to grow all around them. How did they live? How did they organize themselves? How did they interact with this changing world?
Yeah, it's such a key point because the standard story, the one we often hear, is that farming just sort of took over. The Neolithic Revolution happens and boom, everyone's a farmer, evenly, neatly. But the historical evidence, it shows a much more complex picture, a messier one, really. It makes you question this whole idea of linear progress because these non-agricultural communities, they didn't just disappear. They adapted, they thrived. They were absolutely vital parts of the story. It really highlights the amazing diversity of how humans have lived.
Okay, so this idea of uneven adoption, you mentioned some communities even took reversing paths. Can you give us an example?
I mean, farming didn't just pop up everywhere at once. You have groups starting maybe 12,000 years ago in some places, but then millennia later in others. Independent invention, different timelines. And even when groups started farming, it wasn't always like flipping a switch. It wasn't always a full commitment or even a one-way street. Some communities might have done a little farming, maybe domesticated a few animals, but stayed pretty nomadic, moved around with their herds most of the time. Others might have farmed just part of the year. Think about the Sahara. As that area became much drier, many groups who had actually been farming before shifted back to being nomadic pastoralists, herding animals. It just shows how adaptable these non-agricultural ways of life were. They persisted, they changed, they absolutely thrived long after farming began.
That's fascinating. And it seems important, but before we go deeper, to make a clear distinction people often miss. Agriculture isn't exactly the same thing as domestication, right?
Exactly. That's a crucial distinction. Loads of groups domesticated animals, think dogs, sheep, goats, cattle, and even some plants, but didn't necessarily settle down into full-time farming. They often just integrated these domesticated resources into their existing hunting, gathering, or herding strategies. It was more flexible.
Okay, so let's break down these main categories we're talking about. Who were these different groups?
Right. So broadly speaking, you have pastoralists. Their main focus was domesticated animals, cattle, sheep, goats, horses, camels, depending on the region. They didn't typically grow crops regularly, so they were usually nomadic or semi-nomadic, moving to find fresh pastures for their herds. Then you have foragers. These are the folks who continued the ancient human lifestyle, hunting wild animals, fishing, gathering wild plants, essentially living off the land without cultivating it or relying primarily on domesticated herds.
But I imagine these lines could get pretty blurry. Was it always strictly one or the other?
Yeah.
Or did communities often mix things up?
Oh, absolutely blurry. Very few communities fit neatly into just one box, especially in the early agrarian era. Most used a combination of strategies. Think about it. Even settled farmers often kept hunting or fishing to get extra protein or resources. And we see incredible diversity in non-agricultural or semi-agricultural lifestyles. In the Americas, for example, many groups were primarily hunters and gatherers, but some also cultivated specific plants like maize or squash, and the domesticated animals like the llama and alpaca in the Andes, weaving them into their way of life. And get this in places like coastal South America or the Baltic region in Europe, around 5,000 years ago. You had these large, quite wealthy settlements pop up. People living in one place, sedentary. But their economy was based almost entirely on fishing and marine resources, no farming.
Wow, sedentary but not farming. That really challenges the common assumption.
It does. It shows settlement doesn't automatically equal agriculture.
Okay, so let's zoom in on one of these groups, the nomadic pastoralists, especially those from the huge Eurasian steppe. When we talk about them, the horse seems absolutely central.
Oh, undeniably. For pastoralists on the Eurasian steppe, the horse was, well, it was almost everything. The environment there, those vast, dry grasslands, made settled farming really difficult, sometimes impossible. So livestock, especially horses, were the key. They provided protein milk, cheese, sometimes meat. Their dung was critical fuel in treeless areas, hides for clothing, tents, you name it. And crucially, horses were their transportation technology. Add innovations like saddles and stirrups later on, and you get incredible mobility.
And a classic example here would be the Scythians.
Right.
They were famous in the ancient world for their mastery of horses and their military power.
Exactly, the Scythians, and we actually have descriptions from outsiders, like the Greek historian Herodotus. He lived around the 5th century BCE and wrote quite a bit about them. Herodotus really captures their essence, their perceived strength. He wrote, and I'm paraphrasing slightly here, they have no cities or forts, they carry their homes with them, they all shoot from horseback, they live off their cattle, not farming, their wagons are their only houses. How can they possibly be conquered or even attacked?
That's a powerful image. Mobility as invincibility almost.
It highlights how their nomadic lifestyle was their strength and their defense, at least from an outsider's perspective.
But that brings up a really important point you touched on earlier. Herodotus is an outsider looking in. How much can we really know about societies like the Scythians when most of our information comes from people who weren't part of that culture? Especially since many nomadic groups didn't develop or didn't use extensive writing systems of their own.
It's the central challenge for historians studying these groups. We are heavily reliant on these external accounts, Greek, Roman, Chinese, Persian writers. And while they're invaluable, they're always filtered through the lens of a settled, often rival, society, full of potential biases, misunderstandings, stereotypes. We also try to learn by looking at more recent or modern nomadic groups using anthropology, but that's also imperfect. You can't just assume ancient groups were identical to modern ones. So it forces us to be really critical. We constantly have to ask, what's the author's agenda? What cultural assumptions are they making? What are they not telling us? What perspectives are completely missing? It's like trying to piece together a puzzle with half the pieces gone.
Right. So working within those limitations, what can we say about how these nomadic pastoralist groups were typically organized?
Well, generally, family and kinship structures were super important. Like foragers, pastoralists often moved in relatively small groups, maybe 5 to a dozen families traveling together. These groups would cooperate really closely, sharing the work of herding, processing animal products, defending the group. Their ideas about family could sometimes be a bit more flexible than settled farming societies, too. For example, children born outside of a formal marriage often had similar status to those born within one.
And these weren't always just small bands, right? There was political diversity too.
You had these smaller cooperating family groups, but they could also band together into larger confederations or tribes, especially for defense or raiding, and sometimes they formed powerful nomadic empires. The Xiongnu in East Asia are a prime example, a major rival to Han China.
Now, something you mentioned earlier was about gender roles potentially being different. Can you elaborate on that? How did roles compare to, say, settled agricultural societies?
Generally speaking, gender roles in many nomadic, pastoralist, and forager groups seem to have been perhaps more fluid or less rigidly hierarchical than in many settled agrarian societies of the time. Typically, men focused on herding the larger animals, maybe long-distance movements, hunting, warfare, and making certain tools or weapons. Women and older children usually managed the household, prepared food, made clothing, cared for the young kids, and often handled smaller livestock near the camp. But here's the really interesting part. Because men might be away for extended periods on hunts, trading expeditions, or military campaigns, women often had to take on nearly all the responsibilities. This included the incredibly demanding work of setting up and taking down their dwellings, yurts, or tents every time the group moved. And crucially, women were often skilled riders and archers too. They had to be able to defend the camp, the children, the herds if attacked while the men were away. We even find burials of women from some of these cultures with weapons, like arrowheads, which strongly suggests their active role wasn't just domestic.
Wow. Skilled riders, archers, defending the camp. That really paints a different picture than the stereotypical view of women in the ancient world. And didn't you mention a quote from a Chinese source about this?
Yes, there's this amazing line from a Han Dynasty historian describing one of the neighboring nomadic peoples. He wrote something like, when drawing the calculations and plans, the males defer to the opinion of females and settle on their own only the military affairs.
Defer to the women on plans, except for military matters. That implies a significant level of influence and respect for women's judgment in everyday life and decision-making. Quite different from many patriarchal farming societies.
It really suggests a different dynamic. Yeah, a different kind of partnership, perhaps driven by the practical necessities of their mobile lifestyle.
Okay, so beyond their internal structure, how did these pastoralist and foraging groups interact with the big, settled agricultural societies around them? Was it all conflict?
Not at all. Trade was hugely important. Pastoralists had things settled societies needed or wanted animals, meat, milk products, wool, hides. And settled societies had things nomads often lacked, especially grains, other agricultural products, metal goods, textiles. So you see extensive trade networks developing. Pastoralists would bring their goods to exchange points, border towns, or markets.
Right, and this wasn't just casual swapping, was it? This trade could be really organized and vital for both sides.
Exactly. It was often very well established long-term relationships. Think about the Silk Road, those famous trade routes across Eurasia. Nomadic pastoralists were absolutely essential to making it work. They provided the pack animals, camels, horses. They often acted as guides, as guards for the caravans moving through difficult or dangerous territories. Their knowledge of the terrain and their mobility were indispensable.
And you see similar things elsewhere, like with Arab pastoralists in the Middle East providing the camels and expertise for desert caravans, basically making long-distance trade possible in those arid regions.
Precisely. Wheeled vehicles weren't practical in deep sand. Camels, managed by pastoralists, were the key technology.
Okay, so trade was significant. You mentioned the negative portrayals in outside sources. What was the root of that tension?
A lot of it boils down to fundamentally different ways of life and competing interests. Sedentary agricultural societies built up wealth, stored grain, settled villages, material goods. They were powerful in their own way, but also stationary, vulnerable. Nomadic pastoralists, on the other hand, their wealth was mobile, their herds, they could move quickly, strike suddenly, and retreat easily. Raiding settled communities offered a way to get resources, grain, goods, sometimes people without the effort of farming or the need for trade.
So a classic clash between the settled and the mobile. Power versus vulnerability on both sides in different ways.
Pretty much. And this, of course, led to deep resentment and fear from the settled perspective. You see this very clearly in the relationship between various Chinese dynasties and the nomadic groups to their north, like the Xiongnu we mentioned.
Right. There were centuries of conflict, raids, massive Chinese military campaigns trying to control the steppe, building walls. Can you share that quote from the Han historian Sima Qian describing the Yongyunu? It really captures the Chinese perspective.
Sima Qian, writing around the 1st or 2nd century BCE, had some very strong words. He described the Xiongnu as predatory, violent, and without morals. He emphasized they had no walled cities or fixed dwellings, nor do they engage in any kind of agriculture. He said they move about in search of water and pasture. And this is key to the settled mindset. If the battle is going well for them, they will advance, but if not, they will retreat, for they do not consider it a disgrace to run away. Their only concern is self-advantage, and they know nothing of propriety or righteousness.
Do not consider it a disgrace to run away. That really highlights the clash in values, doesn't it? For a Roman or Han soldier, retreat might be shameful, but for a nomad, strategic withdrawal could be essential for survival.
Exactly. His account tells us a lot about Han Chinese perceptions and fears, but it's obviously a biased view. These nomadic groups absolutely had their own codes of honor, their own systems of morality and social rules. They just weren't the same as those of the settled agricultural empires. Much of the conflict likely stemmed from these deep cultural misunderstandings and competing needs, not just inherent violence or immorality on one side.
So wrapping this up, what's the big takeaway here? We've seen that the rise of agriculture wasn't this simple monolithic event.
Not at all.
Non-agricultural communities, these pastoralists, nomads, foragers, they didn't just fade away. They developed these really complex, resilient, fascinating societies that profoundly shaped history alongside the farmers. They weren't just reacting, they were active agents, driving trade, influencing politics, engaging in conflict, creating vibrant cultures of their own.
It really challenges those easy assumptions we sometimes make about human history being a straight line towards farming and cities as the only definition of progress or complexity. It gives us a much richer, more complete, and frankly more interesting picture of the human past. These groups weren't footnotes. They were absolutely integral to global history, to the networks and conflicts and exchanges that shaped the world we know.
Absolutely. So as you continue to think about all this, here are a couple of questions for you to mull over. When you weigh the pros and cons, the stability of farming versus the mobility of pastoralism, which system do you think ultimately offered greater security to its people and why? Think about different kinds of security. And second, imagine if we had more historical accounts written by people from nomadic communities themselves, not just by outsiders. How might that change our understanding of major historical events, conflicts, or even just daily life back then? What stories might we finally hear?